The words were read aloud at 9:47 on a Wednesday morning mid-March. Theodore Brandt had the kind of voice that was designed for courtrooms and conference rooms, measured and unhurried, a voice that had delivered difficult information to difficult people for 30 years without ever losing its professional composure. He sat at the head of a polished mahogany table in his downtown Boston office on the 14th floor, with the city spread out gray and cold behind the floor-to-ceiling windows, and he read from the document in front of him the way a man reads something he has been dreading for some time. The room held 6 people. On one side of the table, Prescott Whitmore, 60 years old in a charcoal suit that had been cut specifically for his frame, his silver hair arranged with the careful precision of a man who understood that appearance was its own form of argument. Beside him, Cordelia Whitmore Fenn, 58, wearing the particular expression she had perfected over decades, an expression of composed concern that communicated emotion without actually containing any. And at the end of that row, Stellan Whitmore, 56, already checking something on his phone beneath the table edge, his attention divided in the way it had always been divided, present in body, but somewhere else entirely in his mind. Each of them had brought a lawyer. 3 attorneys arranged like sentinels behind the chairs of their clients, holding legal pads, watching Theodore Brandt with the focused attention of professionals waiting for the precise moment their expertise would become necessary. On the other side of the table, Nora Elaine Whitmore, 68 years old, white hair that had been silver since she was 55, worn in the simple style Edmund had always preferred. A black dress she had worn to precisely 2 other funerals in her life, both of them for people she had genuinely mourned. No lawyer behind her chair, no legal pad, no one. Theodore was reading the standard language. Testamentary capacity, proper execution, sound mind, and disposing memory. The preliminary architecture of a legal document, the scaffolding that preceded the structure itself. Nora had heard this language before at her parents' funerals, at the funerals of Edmund's colleagues whose estates he had sometimes helped manage. It was the language of orderly endings of lives reduced to their transferable components. She had told herself on the drive into Boston that morning that there was no reason to be afraid. 40 years, 40 years of unwavering loyalty and devotion and sacrifice. Surely Edmund had provided for her. Surely after 4 decades of building a life together, she would be taken care of. The primary residence, Theodore said, in the careful monotone of someone delivering information they would prefer not to be delivering. The Brookline property, currently valued at $2.1 million, to be divided equally among Edmund Whitmore's children from his first marriage. Prescott Whitmore, Cordelia Whitmore Fenn, Stellan Whitmore. Nora felt the first cold tendril of fear move up her spine. The investment accounts, Theodore continued, totaling approximately $4.2 million. Same distribution, equal shares to the 3 children. The cold was spreading through her chest, now making the mechanics of breathing feel deliberate rather than automatic. The retirement accounts, valued at approximately $1.8 million, same distribution. Across the table, Prescott had stopped performing grief. His face had settled into something more honest, a quiet satisfaction that he was making no effort to disguise. Nora's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Theodore, what did Edmund leave for me?" Theodore Brandt looked up from the document. In 30 years of practice, he had delivered difficult information to hundreds of people. He had told grown children they had been disinherited. He had read the words of estranged spouses and bitter relatives and complicated men who had used their final legal act as a last statement about how they truly valued the people in their lives. He had seen grief and shock and rage in that conference room. He had seen collapse. What he did now, looking at Nora Whitmore across the polished mahogany table, was something he had rarely done in 30 years of practice. He looked genuinely pained. "I'm getting to your specific bequest now, Nora." He set the document on the table for a moment. He looked at her directly. "I have to tell you that I argued against the language Edmund used for nearly 2 hours. He was absolutely insistent. I'm very sorry." He picked up the document again. He read, "Edmund Whitmore noted in his will, and I am required to read this verbatim." A pause that lasted no longer than a breath but felt considerably longer. "My wife, Nora Elaine Whitmore, has lived comfortably at my expense for 40 years and has wanted for nothing during the course of our marriage. She has had the benefit of my wealth, my home, my social standing, and a lifestyle far beyond what she could have achieved on her own working as a secretary. This is more than adequate compensation for her companionship and for the domestic services she has provided over the years. Each word arrived like something dropped from a height. Companionship, domestic services, 40 years of love and devotion and the quiet sacrifice of her own ambitions and her own identity reduced to the language of a service contract, a ledger entry, a transaction that had been completed and was now formally closed. Nora felt the room tilt slightly, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone watching would have noticed, just a subtle rearrangement of the world's relationship to vertical. Across the table, Stellan had put his phone away. He was watching her now, his expression unreadable. Cordelia had resumed the performance of composed concern, though something sharper moved underneath it, something that looked almost like pleasure being carefully managed. Prescott was very still, the stillness of a man who has been waiting for a specific moment and has now watched it arrive exactly as anticipated. Theodore continued, "The will goes on to state, while I have appreciated Nora's presence in my home and her efficient management of domestic affairs, I believe my primary obligation and responsibility is to my children and my bloodline. They are my true legacy, the continuation of the Whitmore family name. Therefore, I leave to Nora Elaine Whitmore only the following." He turned a page. "One property I own located at 47 Birchwood Road in the town of Harlow, Vermont, along with all contents contained therein. This property is given to Nora with the express understanding that she will vacate the Brookline residence within 30 days of my death, as that property is needed by my rightful heirs for their use or disposition as they see fit." The silence that followed was absolute, except for the distant sound of Boston traffic 14 floors below and the soft mechanical breath of the building's climate control system. Nora sat very still. Cordelia broke the silence in the particular way she had always broken silences, with her voice set to the frequency of false sympathy, a frequency she had perfected to the point where only someone who had been listening to it for 40 years could hear the hardness underneath. "Daddy mentioned that Harlow property to us years ago. He inherited it from some distant relative back in the early 80s. He said it was just an old, falling-apart house, way out in the middle of nowhere, not worth the hassle of selling." She smiled at Nora with the precision of a woman who had spent decades practicing exactly this smile. "But at least you'll have a roof over your head, Nora. That's something." Prescott was already standing, already moving to practical matters, with the efficiency of a man who had been mentally inhabiting this moment for some time and had prepared accordingly. "We'll need to discuss the timeline for vacating the Brookline house. We're planning to list it immediately. The market is very strong for that neighborhood right now." "The will specifies 30 days, Theodore said, and there was a particular quality to his voice now, something quiet and firm, that Nora had not heard in it before. "Nora is legally entitled to 30 full days to arrange her affairs and relocate. That is non-negotiable." "Of course," Prescott said smoothly. "We're not unreasonable people. Take your full 30 days, Nora. We understand this is a transition for you." Theodore slid a brown envelope across the polished conference table. His hand, Nora noticed with some distant part of her attention, was not entirely steady. "This contains the deed to the Harlow property now transferred to your name. There is also a key and a handwritten note from Edmund that he asked me to include." Inside the envelope was an iron key, old and rusty, the kind of key that belonged in a period drama, heavy and ornate and stained with decades of oxidation. And there was a single sheet of Edmund's expensive cream-colored stationery, the paper he had used for everything important throughout their marriage, his familiar, precise handwriting covering exactly 3 lines. 47 Birchwood Road, Harlow, Vermont. "Nora, this is yours now. Go there as soon as you can. You'll understand everything once you arrive. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you before, but they were always watching, always listening, always looking for ways to challenge anything I tried to do. Trust me one last time, my darling. All my love, always, Edmund. Trust me one last time." After he had just publicly declared her to be adequately compensated domestic help, after leaving her essentially homeless with nothing but an unknown property in a town she had never heard of, and 30 days to disappear from the only home she had known for 40 years. Nora stood. Her legs felt uncertain beneath her, but they held. She picked up the brown envelope. She walked toward the conference room door without saying anything to Prescott or Cordelia or Stellan or their 3 lawyers or the city spread out cold and indifferent behind the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Nora, Theodore's voice quiet and not quite professional anymore. She turned slightly but did not look back at the table. If you need anything. If you have any questions about any of this, please call me. I mean that. She nodded once and walked out. She made it to her car in the parking garage on the second level before the composure she had maintained through 40 minutes of systematic erasure finally broke. She sat in her 10-year-old Honda Civic in the parking garage and wept with the particular thoroughness of someone who has been holding something enormous at bay for a long time and has finally run out of strength to keep holding it. She wept until there was nothing left to weep with. Then she sat in the silence of the parking garage for another 20 minutes, not thinking anything coherent, just existing in the aftermath of something she did not yet have language for. Then she started the car and drove home to the house that was no longer hers. She had been 28 years old in the spring of 1984, young enough to be impressed by things that would not impress her later. Impressed by the size of the offices where she worked, the quality of the furniture, the way important men moved through important rooms as if the architecture had been designed specifically to accommodate their importance. She had come to Boston from a small town in western Massachusetts with a degree from a community college, a good eye for detail and the specific competence of someone who had learned early that being reliably excellent at what you did was the most straightforward path available to you. She had been Edmund Whitmore's secretary for 6 months before he asked her to dinner. Even then, she had understood that this was unusual. Edmund was 45 and one of the most respected attorneys in the city, a man whose name appeared in the kind of newspaper articles that featured photographs of important people at important events. He was precise and commanding and not unkind, though kindness was not the quality that most immediately registered about him. What registered about Edmund Whitmore was competence, the deep-settled competence of a man who had been doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing for a very long time and had become very good at it. She had said yes to dinner because he asked. She had said yes to marriage 6 months after that because he asked and because she believed with the uncomplicated faith of a 28-year-old woman who had grown up in a small town and had not yet learned to read the particular silences that certain men kept in the center of themselves, that she had found both security and love in one decision. She had not understood until considerably later that those two things are not the same. Edmund had 3 children from his first marriage, which had ended when his youngest was 6 years old. Prescott had been 20 at the wedding, Cordelia 18, Stellan 16. All 3 had made their feelings clear before the ceremony was over. "You'll never be our mother," Cordelia had said to her at the wedding reception, her voice precisely calibrated to carry the warmth of a casual observation while delivering the force of a declaration. Don't even try. Nora had tried anyway. She had remembered every birthday for 40 years without a single exception. She had attended every graduation, every significant event, sent gifts that she had chosen with genuine thought and care. She had hosted the holidays, cooked the elaborate meals that Edmund's position required, kept the house in the state of gracious perfection that his colleagues and clients expected. She had bitten her tongue through countless cutting remarks about her background, her education, her failure to give Edmund more children, her presence in a family that had decided before she arrived that she was an intruder rather than a member. She had been the gracious hostess who made everyone comfortable and never demanded anything for herself. She had supported his career, adapted completely to his schedule, remained faithful and devoted through 4 decades of a marriage that had been in many of its external dimensions everything it was supposed to be. Edmund had provided well. He had made sure she had appropriate clothes for the social functions his position required. He had never raised his voice. He had been kind to her in the way that certain men are kind, with a kindness that is fundamentally a form of management rather than intimacy. But there had always been distance. A part of himself he kept carefully separate, sealed behind the same professional composure that he brought to every other difficult situation. He traveled frequently. He maintained a home office that was strictly off-limits. He kept separate bank accounts whose statements Nora had never seen. When she had asked about their finances once early in the marriage, he had smiled and patted her hand with the gentle condescension of a man who found the question charming in its naivety. "Don't worry your pretty head about money, darling. That's my job. Your job is to make this house a home, and you do it perfectly." So she hadn't worried. She had trusted completely the way you trust someone to whom you have pledged your life. She had not asked about the weekend trips he began taking once a month, sometimes more. He said he needed time to decompress at a property he had inherited from a relative. He said the pressures of his position required periodic solitude. She had packed his bag, kissed him goodbye, and trusted him. That trust, she would learn far too late, had been the foundation of sand on which she had built her entire adult life. Edmund Whitmore died on a Thursday morning in February, 2 months before his 85th birthday. Nora found him when she brought his morning coffee, a ritual they had maintained for 40 years, her bringing him coffee in bed at 7 in the morning, the ritual of an ordinary marriage conducted with ordinary devotion. She had carried the cup upstairs and found him exactly as she had left him the night before, lying on his side with the blankets arranged with the neatness that was characteristic of everything about him. She had stood in the doorway for a moment holding the coffee cup, the steam still rising from it, and understood without needing to be told. The doctor who came confirmed it. Massive coronary event, instantaneous, no suffering. She had stood in the bedroom after the doctor left and the body had been removed, and the house was empty in that particular way that houses become empty when the person who defined them is gone, and she had felt something she did not fully understand. Grief, certainly. But underneath the grief, something else, something that moved through her like a single note struck in an empty room, something that she identified reluctantly after several days of refusing to name it as relief. She pushed the thought away as quickly as it surfaced. She told herself it was shock. She told herself she was not well. But the thought kept returning. The funeral was enormous. Edmund had been one of Boston's premier attorneys for over 50 years, and it seemed to Nora, watching the church fill from her position in the second row, as though the city itself had come to mark his passing. Hundreds of people, colleagues, former clients, judges, prominent families, people whose names appeared in the newspaper articles alongside Edmund's photograph. Prescott had explained the seating with a tight, gracious smile. "We've seated you in the second row, Nora. The front row is reserved for immediate family, in case you have family members who need to sit with you." Nora had no family. Her parents had died years ago. She had been an only child. 40 years of being Edmund Whitmore's wife had meant gradually and almost imperceptibly losing touch with the few friends she had brought with her from Western Massachusetts, losing the particular shape of her own life in the larger shape of his. The second row felt like exactly what it was. A public statement about her status delivered in the language of practical arrangements in spatial logistics, deniable by any individual element while unmistakable in its totality. During the service, colleague after colleague stood to eulogize Edmund Whitmore, the brilliant legal mind, Edmund Whitmore, the devoted father, Edmund Whitmore, the pillar of the community. Not one person mentioned Edmund Whitmore, the husband. Not one word was spoken about the woman who had stood beside him, supported him, built a home for him, devoted her entire adult life to him. At the reception afterward held at Prescott's house in Cambridge, Nora overheard Cordelia near the catering table speaking to a cluster of her friends. "It's just so hard," Cordelia was saying. Her eyes were completely dry. "Losing Daddy. At least we have each other, the real family. To get through this, the real family." As if Nora had been playing pretend for 40 years. The 30 days that followed the will reading were a masterclass in a particular kind of cruelty. The cruelty of people who have perfected entitlement into an art form, and who understand that the most effective version of cruelty is the kind that maintains plausible deniability, the kind that can always be described by anyone watching as simply practical. Prescott, Cordelia, and Stellan came to the Brookline house nearly every day. They brought contractors. They brought interior designers. They brought real estate agents who moved through the rooms with measuring tapes and clipboards, speaking in the specific vocabulary of people who assessed spaces for their market potential rather than their human history. They discussed knocking down walls, opening up the floor plan, updating the kitchen, removing the gardens. They spoke about all of this in Nora's presence, not behind her back, not in hushed voices in other rooms, directly in front of her as she sat in the living room or stood in the kitchen or moved through the hallways of the house where she had lived for 40 years. They did not ask her to leave rooms. They simply acted as though she were not there. She was a ghost haunting a house that had already been reassigned. One morning, Nora was sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee when Cordelia walked through with an interior designer she had brought from Newbury Street, a young woman with a portfolio, in the particular confident energy of someone accustomed to transforming spaces for people with significant budgets. We'll definitely open up this whole space, Cordelia was saying, gesturing broadly at the kitchen walls at the cabinets Nora had chosen 20 years ago, and the layout she had refined over 2 decades of cooking elaborate dinners for Edmund's colleagues and clients. Knock out this wall, create a huge open concept kitchen dining living area. That's what sells now. That's what buyers in this neighborhood are looking for. She did not look at Nora. The interior designer did not look at Nora. They moved through the kitchen, discussing square footage and resale value and staging strategies, as though the woman sitting 3 feet away were a piece of furniture that would be disposed of along with everything else before the listing went live. Another afternoon, a real estate agent stood in the living room with Stellan and discussed comparable properties and listing timelines in the overgrown gardens through the window, which he described as significantly behind current standards and in need of substantial professional attention before any showings could be scheduled. Those gardens had been Nora's. Every rose bush she had planted, every perennial bed she had designed to bloom in sequence, from March through November, a living calendar she had tended for 30 years. Every choice and every hour had been hers. They were, she had sometimes thought, in her private moments, the most honest expression of herself that this house contained. Now they were overgrown obstacles to a profitable sale. The nights were when the real fear arrived. Nora would lie awake in the master bedroom in the bed where she had slept beside Edmund for 4 decades, and her mind would move through increasingly specific versions of catastrophe. She was 68 years old. She had not worked in 40 years. Her last employment had been 1984 as a secretary in an era before computers had transformed what that work meant and what it required. Who would hire her now? What could she possibly do? The Harlow property was almost certainly worthless. Cordelia had said as much with the confidence of someone who had no reason to lie about it. A falling-apart house in the middle of nowhere. Maybe $50,000 if she was lucky. That might last 3 years if she was incredibly frugal. And then what, 71 years old and destitute, dependent on systems designed for people who had planned poorly and expected nothing. Some nights the fear was so complete that she could not breathe properly. She would get up and pace the bedroom in the dark, trying to force the specific kind of calm that had sustained her through 40 years of swallowing her voice, and she could not find it. Other nights the fear transformed into something else entirely, something hotter, a rage so unexpected in its intensity that it surprised her that she barely recognized as her own emotion, rather than something that had entered the room from outside. How dare he? How dare Edmund do this to her? How dare he let her spend 40 years believing they were partners, believing she was secure, believing that the life they had built together was genuinely shared, only to reveal in death that she had been, in his own words, domestic help whose contract had expired. But rage is expensive. Rage requires energy that Nora was rapidly depleting, and she could not maintain it alongside the terror. So mostly she just felt numb, moving through the mechanical motions of packing up a life that had turned out to be built on something considerably less solid than she had believed. She packed 3 suitcases. She packed 2 boxes of personal items, photographs from before her marriage letters. Her mother had written her over the years, a few books that had belonged to her grandmother. That was it. 40 years condensed to what 5 people could carry in a single trip. On the 28th day, Nora was standing at the kitchen sink, the same kitchen where she had prepared thousands of meals over 4 decades, when she overheard Prescott and Cordelia talking in the dining room. She was not meant to hear it. They either did not know she was there, or they had stopped caring whether she heard. I honestly cannot believe Father left her anything at all, Cordelia was saying. The Harlow property is probably worth $50,000 at most. He should have left her absolutely nothing. He felt guilty, Prescott said. 40 years is a long time to string someone along, even if she was essentially just the help. The Harlow place was his way of easing his conscience without actually reducing what we got. Well, she should be grateful we're being so civilized about this transition. Cordelia's voice carried the comfortable authority of someone for whom civility had never cost anything. Most women her age with no marketable skills and no family would end up in subsidized housing. At least she'll be able to sell that dump and have a little nest egg for a few years. They laughed, a mutual, casual laugh, the laugh of people who had never worried about having a roof over their heads or food to eat, who had never had to calculate whether they could afford both. Nora gripped the edge of the sink. She could feel the 40 years of conditioning pressing against the rage, The 40 years of training that had taught her to swallow her voice to avoid conflict, to be the gracious woman who never made scenes. The conditioning had been so thorough, so deeply written into the way she moved through the world, that it held even now, even here, even after everything. She did not march into the dining room. She let go of the sink. She went upstairs to the bedroom. She stood at the window and looked at the garden in the early morning light, at the roses beginning to open in the particular sequence she had spent years designing, and she thought about the iron key in the brown envelope on the kitchen table. Trust me one last time, my darling. She stood at that window for a long time. On her final morning in the house, Nora woke before dawn. She moved through each room one last time. She had expected to feel the weight of 4 decades, expected to be stopped in doorways by the accumulated memory of everything that had happened in these rooms. Instead, she felt almost nothing. The master bedroom was just a room. The living room was just a room. The kitchen was just a room. The only place that stopped her was the garden. She stood among the roses in the gray early morning, her hands at her sides, and she let herself feel it fully for the first time since Edmund died. This was the only space in 40 years that had felt authentically hers. This was where she had made choices that were genuinely her own, designed something from her own vision, tended something with her own hands, and watched it become what she had imagined it could become. Now it would belong to people who saw it as a problem to be solved before the listing photographs were taken. She went back inside. She loaded her car, 3 suitcases, 2 boxes. The wedding photograph from the living room mantel, which she took despite Prescott's protest that it was technically property of the estate. Prescott arrived at 1:30 early with the efficiency of someone who wanted to confirm the departure in person. Nora stood beside her loaded car in the driveway and looked at him. He was 60 years old, her husband's son, the boy who had glared at her across the church on her wedding day, with a hostility he had never since bothered to disguise. "Prescott," she said. Her voice was quiet, but carried a weight she hadn't known she possessed. He looked at her with the particular patience of someone who has already won and is simply waiting for the formalities to conclude. "Do you have any idea what it is like," she said, "to give someone 40 years of your life and be told it meant nothing?" Something moved in his face. Not remorse, not quite. More like discomfort. The discomfort of a man who prefers his cruelties to be invisible and has found himself momentarily required to stand in the light of one of them. "Father left you a property," he said. "You're not getting nothing." "Your father left me a mystery," Nora said. "A house I have never seen in a town I have never heard of. You and your siblings got millions of dollars in this house and the satisfaction of knowing your father considered you his legacy. I got a rusty key in 30 days to disappear from the only home I have known for 4 decades." She opened the car door. "So no, Prescott, I don't think you have any concept of what this has been like." She got in before he could respond, before she could say anything else, before the controlled composure she had been maintaining could fracture entirely in the driveway of a house that was no longer hers. The brown envelope sat on the passenger seat. Her GPS showed the address she had entered the night before. 47 Birchwood Road, Harlow, Vermont. 2 hours and 40 minutes, the automated voice had told her. 2 hours and 40 minutes to a completely unknown future. She started the car and drove away from Brookline without looking in the rearview mirror. Theodore Brandt called her when she was 40 minutes outside of Boston. She answered through the car's speaker, her eyes on the highway ahead of her, the Massachusetts landscape moving past at 65 miles per hour. "Nora," he said, "I wanted to reach you before you got too far. I have something to tell you that I couldn't say in the conference room." She waited. "When Edmund came to me about the will language," he said, "the language about domestic services, I pushed back hard. I told him it was cruel. I told him it was unnecessary and that it would cause you genuine pain. I spent 2 hours arguing with him about it." She kept her eyes on the road. "And he said to you," she said. "What did he say to you when you argued with him?" Theodore was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had a different quality than it had in the conference room. Quieter, more careful. He said, "Theodore, I need those words in the document exactly as written." He paused. He said, "Those words protect her. They don't diminish her. They make what comes next legally bulletproof." He told me to trust him. The highway moved under her tires. Outside the windows, the landscape was beginning to change. The dense urban architecture of the greater Boston area giving way to the longer, lower horizons of rural Massachusetts. I didn't understand it when he said it, Theodore continued. I thought he was rationalizing something he didn't have the courage to do differently. I went along with it because he was my client, and it was his legal right to make the choices he made. He paused again. I think I'm beginning to understand it now. Nora said nothing for a long moment. Thank you for telling me, she said finally. She ended the call and drove north. There is a specific quality to the silence of a long drive when you have nowhere to return to. It is not peaceful silence. It is not the companionable silence of someone traveling towards something known and desired. It is the silence of a person sitting with the totality of their situation with all of its dimensions, without the distraction of familiar rooms and familiar routines to soften the edges of it. Nora drove through that silence for 2 hours. She thought about 40 years. She thought about Cordelia's voice at the wedding reception and the way it had sounded exactly the same 30 years later outside the catering table at the funeral. She thought about Edmund's careful handwriting on 3 lines of expensive stationery. She thought about the photographs she had found tucked inside the brown envelope, the hundreds of images of her own life she had not known were being documented. She thought about what it meant that Edmund had been coming to a house she had never known existed once a month for 40 years. She thought about what it meant that he had written those words in his will, while simultaneously writing those 3 lines on his personal stationery. Trust me one last time, my darling. The Vermont border passed without announcement. The landscape shifted. The hills became more pronounced, the forest denser, the town smaller and more widely spaced. She followed her GPS off the highway onto a state road, and then off the state road onto a county road, and the distances between buildings grew, and the quality of the silence outside her windows changed from the silence of sparse habitation to something older. The silence of land that has not been heavily managed, of forests that have been growing at their own pace for a very long time. The town of Harlow appeared as a cluster of buildings arranged around a small square that was more practical than decorative. A general store with an awning that had been repainted recently, a diner with checked curtains, a white church with a modest steeple, a post office that looked like it had been there since the town was founded, a library that might well have been the original library, its stone construction, the particular gray of New England buildings that had been standing long enough to have opinions about the weather. As she drove slowly down the main street, following her GPS, she noticed something that she would not be able to explain precisely when she thought about it later. The people she could see had stopped what they were doing. An elderly man sweeping the sidewalk in front of the general store had paused mid-sweep looking at her car. A woman arranging a window display in the diner had turned to watch with an expression that was not curiosity exactly. Something more specific than curiosity. Something that looked from the distance of a passing car window like recognition. A woman in her mid-70s wearing a cotton dress and carrying a wicker basket covered with a checkered cloth had stepped out of the general store's door and was watching Nora's car with an expression of settled confirmation, as if she were watching something she had known was coming. Nora's GPS directed her off the main street onto Birchwood Road, which began as a narrow paved lane and became after perhaps 300 yards a dirt road, with old tire tracks pressed into dry grass and a strip of weeds growing down its center. Ancient oaks lined both sides. Their trunks were the diameter of small rooms. Their canopy closed overhead and turned the afternoon light into something filtered and green and very still. She drove slowly. The road was rough. After what felt like considerably more than the quarter mile, it actually was her, GPS announced in its cheerful automated voice that she had arrived at her destination. Nora stopped the car. She sat for a long moment without looking up. She was 68 years old with 3 suitcases and 2 boxes and a rusty iron key and a note from a dead man telling her to trust him. She was sitting in a car on a dirt road in a Vermont town she had never heard of, and whatever was waiting outside the windshield would be, for better or worse, the next chapter of a story she was only beginning to understand had not been the story she thought she was living. She took a breath, she looked up, and everything she thought she knew about the man she had married shifted so fundamentally and so quickly that she felt it physically in her chest, the specific sensation of a belief that has been holding a great weight for a long time suddenly releasing that weight and finding itself unexpectedly impossibly light. The house was not falling apart. It was built from gray fieldstone that had to date back to the 18th century or earlier. Two stories with a steep slate roof that looked not just intact, but recently maintained its tiles uniformly dark and solid. White painted trim around leaded glass windows that caught the afternoon light and scattered it in prismatic fragments across the stone walls. A heavy oak front door set under a small covered portico with carved wooden supports, the carving faded with age, but still present, still deliberate. Ivy climbed portions of the stone in the way that ivy climbs walls, when it has been trained rather than simply tolerated, creating patterns of green that look like choices rather than neglect. The grounds were overgrown, but overgrown in the way that formal gardens become overgrown when they have not been tended for a season rather than abandoned for decades. She could see the bones of an original design through the overgrowth. Stone pathways only partially obscured by grass. Rose beds blooming wild, but unmistakably roses the kind that had been planted with intention. What looked like a kitchen garden, now given over to an abundant tangle of herbs and wildflowers. And at the center of what had once been a formal garden area, a stone fountain. Silent and dry, but standing. Still elegant. She was still sitting in the car, not quite capable of moving, when she heard footsteps approaching on the dirt road. The woman with the wicker basket was walking toward her with a purpose that seemed entirely inconsistent with someone who had simply happened to be taking a walk on a dirt road in the early afternoon. She stopped beside Nora's car. She looked through the window with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of someone who has been waiting for a long time and is ready to stop waiting. "You're Nora," she said. It was not a question. She said it with the certainty of someone confirming an established fact. "We've been expecting you. I'm Dorothea Finch. I run the general store in town." She held up the basket. "Bread, eggs, milk, coffee, some cheese, and a few other things. Figured you might need supplies. The house has been maintained, but there's no fresh food stocked. Come on, I'll help you get settled." Nora got out of the car on legs that felt like they were receiving instructions from somewhere outside herself. "Edmund told you I was coming," she managed. Dorothea's expression settled into something that was understanding and pity, and something else, something harder to name. "Edmund came here every month for 40 years, she said, sometimes more. Every single time for 40 years, he'd stop by the store and we'd talk. He'd show me photographs on his phone and tell me stories. He'd ask if there was anything more that should be done to the house to prepare it." She looked at Nora with the steady gaze of a woman who had kept a secret for a very long time and had finally been released from the keeping of it. "He said that when he died, his wife Nora would come. He said you wouldn't know about it beforehand because he'd kept it secret for your protection. He said his children had never accepted, you had always resented him marrying you, and that if they'd known about this property, they would have found legal ways to claim it. So he hid it. From everyone. Even from you." She gestured toward the house. "Come on," she said. "Let me show you what he built for you. It's time you saw it." Nora followed Dorothea Finch up the stone pathway toward the heavy oak door under its carved portico. Her 3 suitcases still in the car. The brown envelope in her hand, the rusty iron key that was apparently not rusty at all, in the way that mattered, that had been waiting for exactly this turn, in exactly this lock for exactly this moment. Dorothea used the key. The lock turned smoothly. The door swung open without a sound. "Welcome home, Nora," Dorothea said quietly, stepping aside. Nora crossed the threshold, and the ground shifted beneath her feet, not in the terrible way it had shifted in Theodore Brandt's conference room, not in the way that the world tilts when something you believed is taken away, but in the way it shifts when something you did not know you had been waiting for finally after 40 years arrives. Part 2, The Sanctuary in the Dark. The interior of the house stopped her in the doorway. Not because it was grand, though it was in the particular way that old houses built with genuine craft and genuine care are grand, not through scale but through accumulated intention. Not because it was unexpected, though everything about it was unexpected. It stopped her because of what covered the walls. Every available surface, every shelf, every flat space that the eye could find from the entry hall through to the main room beyond. Photographs, hundreds of them. Framed in simple, dark wood, framed in antique gilt, framed in plain silver that had tarnished to a soft gray. Some large, occupying significant portions of wall space. Some small, clustered in arrangements that had clearly been curated over time by someone who thought carefully about where things belonged. All of them were photographs of Nora. She stood in the doorway and looked at the nearest one. Herself in the Brookline garden, kneeling in the soil with both hands deep in a bed of perennials, she was dividing her face turned slightly upward toward the afternoon sun, her expression one of complete and unperformed contentment. She had not known the photograph was being taken. She had never seen this photograph before in her life. The date penciled in small numbers on the lower edge of the frame, April 1991. She was 35 years old in that photograph. She moved to the next, herself reading in the leather chair by the living room window of the Brookline house, a cup of tea on the table beside her, the afternoon light making her hair the particular color it had been before it went silver. The expression on her face was the expression of someone entirely absorbed in what they were reading, someone who had temporarily forgotten that the world existed beyond the page in front of them. She had not known this photograph existed either. She could not have said with certainty when it had been taken. She did not know where Edmund had been standing when he took it. July 1997, said the small, penciled number in the corner. She was 41. She moved further into the room, past the wide plank floors that glowed with the deep, warm patina of age and careful maintenance, past the massive stone fireplace with its single-piece oak mantel, past the leather sofa, and the simple chairs positioned to take advantage of the light that came through the leaded windows. She moved through the room slowly looking at the photographs as she went, and the thing that happened to her as she moved was not what she would have expected. She expected to feel something like vindication, something like relief, something that could be cleanly identified and named. What she actually felt was more complicated than that, more difficult. A tangle of emotions that she could not immediately separate from each other. Grief and wonder and love, and a particular kind of loss that she did not yet have language for. The loss of something she had not known she was missing. The loss of the version of Edmund that this house contained, the version of Edmund that had been coming here every month for 40 years and standing in this room looking at these photographs of the woman he had left at home. Dorothea set the basket on the kitchen counter and stood quietly in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room, watching Nora move through the photographs without speaking. She had the particular quality of stillness that certain people develop over long years of being trusted with other people's significant moments, the quality of someone who understands that the most useful thing they can do in a specific situation is nothing at all. Nora stopped in front of a photograph she recognized. Herself, asleep in the leather chair in Edmund's home office at the Brookline house, a book fallen open across her chest, the late afternoon sun coming through the window behind her and making a kind of halo of the silver in her hair. She remembered that afternoon. She had come into the office to return a book to the shelves and had sat down for a moment in his chair and fallen asleep in the warmth of the late sun. She had woken up an hour later alone in the room, the house quiet around her. Edmund had been there. She had not known it. He had taken this photograph and then left her to sleep. October 2018, said the penciled number. She would have been 62. He loved you very much, Dorothea said from the doorway. Her voice was quiet and matter-of-fact, the voice of someone stating something they have known for a long time and are no longer uncertain about. Anyone who came here could see that immediately. This was his shrine to you, his private place where he could come and be the man he actually was beneath everything else. Nora turned and looked at the room from the center of it, turning slowly, taking in the full scope of what Edmund had built here. Let me show you the rest, Dorothea said. Then I'll leave you to rest and take everything in. But you need to see it all first. You need to understand what he actually left you. The kitchen was a beautiful collision of eras, an antique wood-burning stove that had been carefully restored sitting beside modern appliances that had been chosen to blend rather than contrast. Copper pots hanging from ceiling racks above a deep farmhouse sink. Open shelving, displaying dishes that Nora had never seen before, clearly chosen with care, a complete set of something old and lovely. Every element of the kitchen spoke of someone who had thought carefully about what a kitchen should feel like. Someone who understood that a kitchen is not primarily a functional space, but an emotional one. There was a dining room with a long oak table that could seat 12, though Nora noticed immediately that it had almost certainly never seated 12 in this house. The chairs around it were positioned in the particular way that furniture settles when it has been used by one person over many years, rather than arranged for guests. Edmund had eaten at this table alone. For 40 years, once a month, he had sat at this table in this house that existed in the world only as his private facts surrounded by photographs of the wife he had left at home and eaten his meals alone. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms. The master bedroom had its own fireplace and windows that looked out over the forest and more photographs. A different quality of photograph up here, she noticed. More intimate. Less the photographs of a man documenting something precious, and more the photographs of a man trying to keep company with someone who was not present. Candid shots that must have required considerable patience and concealment. Nora laughing at something someone had said at a dinner party. Nora in the garden in early morning, before she had fully composed herself for the day, still in her robe, her hair loose. Nora in a moment of private reflection that she would never have allowed to be photographed if she had known it was being captured. She had not known. For 40 years she had not known. The house has been maintained through a fund Edmund established, Dorothea said as they came back downstairs. He arranged everything through the local bank. Utilities, property taxes, routine maintenance repairs as needed. It's all covered and funded for the next 50 years. You'll never have to worry about those expenses. She stopped at a door beneath the staircase that Nora had not initially noticed. A door set flush with the wall and painted the same color as the surrounding woodwork. He used this room more than any other, Dorothea said, when he was here. She opened the door. The room was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12, with no windows. 3 of its 4 walls were lined floor to ceiling with built-in shelving. The shelves held not books, but files. Folders, binders, document boxes, all organized with the meticulous precision that had characterized everything about Edmund's professional life, each item labeled in his familiar, precise handwriting with dates and names and categories that Nora could not immediately parse. The 4th wall held a beautiful antique mahogany desk, dark with age and use, with a green-shaded banker's lamp and a leather chair that had been sat in so many times over so many years that it had taken on the specific shape of the person who had used it. Edmund's shape. Edmund's particular way of sitting, slightly forward weight, centered the posture of a man who had been working at desks for 60 years. And there in the exact center of the desk, positioned with the deliberate precision of someone who had given careful thought to placement, was a thick cream-colored envelope. "My beloved Nora," it said on the front in Edmund's handwriting. "This," Dorothea said softly, "is what he most wanted you to find." She stepped back from the doorway. "I'll be in the kitchen," she said. "Take whatever time you need." Nora stood at the desk for a long moment without touching the envelope. The room was very quiet. The house was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the forest that surrounded the property, a bird was doing something complex and repetitive, a sound that felt like it had been going on since before the house was built and would continue after it was gone. She sat down in Edmund's chair. It fit her differently than it would have fit him. He had been taller, with broader shoulders, and the chair's worn sections reflected his proportions rather than hers. But she sat in it anyway in the shape his years of sitting had carved into the leather, and she picked up the envelope. The paper was heavy stock, the same paper Edmund had used for everything that mattered. He had sealed it with actual wax, dark red, pressed with the ring he had worn on his right hand for as long as Nora had known him. She had always thought of that ring as merely decorative. She understood now that he had used it for this. She broke the seal. 5 pages. His handwriting, which she had been reading for 40 years, covered them completely, edge to edge, with the careful compression of someone who had a great deal to say and was determined to say it precisely. "My dearest, most beloved Nora, if you are reading this, I am gone and you have found the sanctuary. I am desperately, profoundly sorry it had to happen this way. I am sorry I could not share this place with you while I was alive, could not bring you here, could not let you see what I had been building for you all these years. But Prescott, Cordelia, and Stellan were always watching, always waiting for any opening that would allow them to challenge my decisions. If they had known about this property, they would have found ways to claim it. Lawyers can always find ways, as I unfortunately know too well from 5 decades of practice. So I hid it. For 40 years, I protected it for you. I have been coming to this house since I inherited it from my uncle Thaddeus Whitmore in the spring of 1984, 3 months after our wedding. Thaddeus was a quiet man who had lived simply despite having more than most people understood. He left me this house with a single instruction in his will: protect this place for someone you love more than life itself. It deserves to shelter love, not greed. For 40 years, I've been protecting it for you. Nora, I know what my will said. I know how much those words must have hurt you, sitting in Theodore's office, hearing yourself described as adequately compensated domestic help. Please understand. I wrote every word of that document with calculation and purpose because I knew Prescott, Cordelia, and Stellan would read every syllable looking for any language they could use to challenge anything left to you. I gave them exactly what they wanted: the visible wealth, the obvious assets, the things they could display as proof of their inheritance in their father's favor. What they do not yet understand is what I gave them. The Brookline house carries a substantial mortgage I took out 18 months ago. They will discover this shortly. It also has historic preservation easements recorded in the county deed that will make any significant renovation or sale an extraordinarily lengthy and expensive process. The property taxes alone will be considerable. I have calculated with some care that keeping the house will cost them significantly more than they anticipated, and selling it will take considerably longer and return considerably less. The investment accounts are locked inside trust structures I designed myself with the assistance of attorneys in 3 separate states, ensuring no single attorney had full visibility of the complete architecture. Prescott must maintain continuous employment and pass annual ethical evaluations conducted by an independent trustee. The trustee is a retired federal judge named Harrington Alcott, who takes his responsibilities with what I would describe as exceptional seriousness. Cordelia must demonstrate stable family relationships defined specifically in order to access her distributions. Given her history, this will be essentially impossible to satisfy consistently. Stellan's inheritance is structured as a business investment trust that requires his direct active management. If he fails to manage it properly, and Stellan has never in his life managed anything properly for more than 6 consecutive months, the funds dissolve to charity automatically. I gave my children exactly what they wanted in exactly the form most calculated to make them miserable. But you, my most beloved Nora, I gave you everything that actually matters. This house sits on 247 acres of protected woodland in Harlow County, Vermont. I had the property formally assessed 14 months ago. Conservation groups have expressed serious interest in purchasing the land at values ranging between $3 and $4 million. The decision to sell or keep or develop is entirely yours. The house itself as a historic structure carries its own significant value independent of the land. More importantly than any monetary value, I gave you freedom. The trust fund I established will cover all property expenses for 50 years. You will never have to worry about this place being taken from you or becoming unaffordable. The deed has been in your name only since 1984, established as a gift completely separate from our marriage, and therefore completely outside the reach of any challenge based on marital assets. Harriet Solberg in Burlington has been my attorney on this matter for the past 2 years. She is expecting to hear from you and has everything you will need if anyone tries to challenge your ownership of this property. Which they may. There is more. The filing cabinets in this study contain documents I have accumulated over 40 years of legal practice. Information about powerful families and influential people, about arrangements and decisions and secrets that certain people believe were safely hidden. I never used this information. That would have been wrong. But I kept it documented and organized because I understood, as I have always understood, that information is the most durable form of insurance. Folders labeled with Prescott's name, Cordelia's name, and Stellan's name contain documentation of financial dealings and personal matters. They would very much prefer remain private. Use this information only if you must, only if they force your hand. But know that it is there and that it is thorough. Finally, and I want you to hear this clearly, every single photograph in this house was taken with love. Every moment I spent here over 40 years was spent thinking of you, missing you, wishing I could bring you here, knowing I could not risk it until after my death had made everything legally secure and permanently yours. You were the best part of my life, Nora. The only pure and genuinely good thing in a life that was otherwise full of performance and obligation and the maintenance of a public persona that had very little to do with who I actually was. I am sorry I was not braver. I am sorry I prioritized keeping peace with my children over standing up publicly for the woman I loved. I am sorry I made you feel for 4 decades that you were somehow secondary when you were always the center of everything that mattered to me. I failed you in life by being weak in the ways that cost you most. I hope I have succeeded in death by being clever in the ways that protect you most. This sanctuary is yours to live in, to sell, to transform into whatever you wish. But know that it was built from love, protected by love, and given to you with more love than I ever managed to express adequately while I was breathing. Forever and always yours, Edmund. Nora read the letter through twice. Then she sat for a long time in Edmund's chair in the small, windowless study, with the letter on the desk in front of her, in the filing cabinets along the walls, in the green-shaded lamp casting its warm circle of light. She expected to feel something clean and clear. Relief, perhaps, or gratitude, or the particular satisfaction of having a story resolve itself into coherence after a long period of confusion. What she felt instead was considerably more complicated. He loved me enough to build this, she thought. He loved me enough to come here every month for 40 years and stand in rooms full of photographs of me. He loved me enough to plan this with a precision and patience that most people would find extraordinary. But he did not love me enough to stand beside me when his children treated me as an intruder in my own marriage. He did not love me enough to say publicly and clearly and without qualification that the woman he had married was his partner and his equal, and not a paid domestic arrangement that could be terminated at his convenience. He had given her a fortress. He had not given her the one thing she had actually needed, which was for him to be brave enough while he was alive to choose her visibly in front of the people who needed to see it. She sat with both of these things simultaneously, the love and the failure of the love, and she did not try to resolve them into something simpler than they were. She was still sitting with them when Dorothea appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of tea. They sat at the kitchen table in the fading afternoon light, and Dorothea talked about Edmund the way people talk about someone they knew well and genuinely liked. He was a different person here, Dorothea said. Not different in values or in fundamental character, but different in expression. In Boston, he was the impressive attorney, the prominent man, the father and professional. Here he was just Edmund. He'd come into the store and we'd sit and talk for an hour. He'd help carry groceries for whoever needed it. He'd attend the church fundraiser. He was present in the way that people are present when they're not performing anything. He talked about you constantly. Nora looked at her tea. Every visit, Dorothea continued. He'd show me photographs on his phone and tell me stories. He talked about your garden more than almost anything else. He'd describe what was blooming and what you were planning to plant and what had surprised you that season. He was very specific, the kind of specific that comes from paying close attention to something you love. She paused. He said you were the only person who had ever loved him for himself rather than for what he represented or what he could provide. He said keeping this place secret from his children was the hardest thing he had ever done. He said every time he drove away from Harlow to go back to Boston, he felt like he was abandoning the better version of himself. Why, Nora said. Her voice was very quiet. Why didn't he just tell me? Why didn't he bring me here while he was alive? Dorothea was quiet for a moment. Fear, she said finally. His children had already demonstrated early in your marriage that they would use any leverage available to them. Edmund knew that if they discovered this property, they would challenge it in court before he was gone. Once he was gone, the gift was legally secure in ways it couldn't be while he was alive. He was a lawyer. He thought in those terms. She looked at Nora steadily. That doesn't mean it was the right choice. He knew that too. He talked about it. He used to say that his great failure was being brave enough in every professional context and a coward in the one personal context that mattered most. The light was going outside the kitchen windows. The forest had turned dark green in the late afternoon shade. He prepared this place for 40 years for you, Nora said. She was thinking aloud rather than speaking to Dorothea. He maintained it and photographed it and stocked it and established trusts and arranged attorneys and planned every detail. Yes, Dorothea said simply, and it never once occurred to him to simply tell me it existed. Dorothea said nothing. The silence was his own acknowledgement. Nora stood and carried her cup to the sink. Thank you, she said, for the food and for telling me, for keeping his secret all these years. Dorothea rose and picked up her basket. He was a good man in the ways he was good, she said, and he was a failure in the ways he failed. I think those 2 things were both true. I think you deserve to know both of them. She left. Nora stood at the kitchen sink and looked out the window at the forest in the fading light. and thought about 40 years of a man driving away from the better version of himself to return to the performance of his Boston life, and she tried to find the clean emotion inside it, the clear feeling that would tell her what to feel. She could not find it. There was no clean emotion available, only the complicated truth of a complicated love expressed in a complicated way by a man who had been in Dorothea's precise formulation, good in the ways he was good and a failure in the ways he failed. She ran water over the cups and left them in the sink and went to find the bedroom she would sleep in. The filing cabinets waited. She opened them the following morning, methodically beginning with the documentation of the property itself. The deed from 1984. Her name alone on it, the language of the transfer, establishing it clearly as a gift entirely separate from any marital estate. Financial records for the maintenance trust, 50 years of coverage confirmed funded. Through a mechanism she did not fully understand, but whose practical effect was unmistakable. Her expenses here, whatever they might be, were paid for as long as she might reasonably live. She opened the second cabinet. Here were the professional files. Edmund's documentation of cases and clients and arrangements organized with the meticulous precision of a man who had never trusted memory over record. She moved through them carefully, not reading in detail, understanding only the scope of what they represented. 40 years of observation and documentation by one of Boston's most experienced attorneys. She opened the third cabinet. 3 folders at the front, each labeled in Edmund's handwriting. Prescott Whitmore, Cordelia Whitmore Fenn, Stellan Whitmore. She sat in Edmund's chair and read each one. It took most of the morning. Prescott's folder contained documentation of business arrangements that had been structured with considerable attention to the technical appearance of legality while achieving outcomes that would not survive close scrutiny. Investment decisions made on information that should not have been available to him. A pattern of behavior documented over years that a federal examiner would find very interesting. Cordelia's folder documented financial arrangements made during her 3 divorces that had been in Edmund's precise language, not consistent with full disclosure obligations. Funds moved through structures that obscured their nature and origin. Agreements signed on the basis of information withheld from the parties who had signed them. Stellan's folder documented accounting practices in the business he had run for 12 years that deviated from what had been reported to tax authorities with a specificity and regularity that suggested pattern rather than error. Edmund had collected all of this over decades. He had kept it perfectly organized. He had never used it. He had left it to her. She sat for a long time after closing the third folder, her hands flat on the desk. Then Theodore Brandt called. Nora, his voice said through the phone on the desk, and she knew from the quality of it, from the particular careful tone that certain voices take on when they are about to deliver information that requires care, that something had changed. I have to tell you something, he said. Prescott has filed a legal challenge to the will. She waited. He's claiming the Harlow property is a marital asset that should be subject to equal division. He is arguing that any property of significant value acquired during a marriage should be treated as jointly owned, regardless of how the deed was originally structured. What is his basis? Nora asked. Her voice sounded, she noticed, considerably steadier than she felt. He has obtained a letter, Theodore said, from a physician. The letter states that Edmund showed signs of diminished mental capacity during the last 18 months of his life and may not have been competent to make certain legal decisions regarding asset disposition. There was a pause. Nora, if a court accepts that argument, the property could be ruled part of the marital estate and subject to division. You could lose it. She looked at the filing cabinets against the wall. How long do I have? She said. The challenge was filed this morning. You have 30 days to respond formally. But Prescott's attorneys are aggressive and well-resourced. They will move quickly. If you want to contest this, you need to move quickly as well. She said, I need to make a call. She ended the call with Theodore and sat in the quiet of the study for a moment. Outside, the forest was doing what forests do in the late morning, the particular activity of a place that has its own processes entirely independent of human concerns. She opened the bottom drawer of Edmund's desk. The envelope was there. She had found it the previous day, but had not opened it, not yet sensing that it was separate from the letter, that it served a different purpose. The outside read, If they challenge. Inside was a piece of paper with a phone number and a single line, Harriet Solberg Burlington. She has everything. Call her when you need to. Nora dialed. The phone rang twice. Harriet Solberg had the voice of a woman in her early 60s who has been doing difficult work for a long time and has developed a particular kind of directness that comes from too much experience with people who want to obscure rather than clarify. She answered before Nora had finished explaining why she was calling. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "I have been expecting your call. Not this soon, honestly. Edmund thought it would be at least 6 months before they organized themselves enough to challenge it. But we're prepared. Is it Prescott?" "Yes," Nora said. "The physician's letter," "Yes." Edmund anticipated this possibility 18 months ago and retained 3 independent physicians to conduct formal cognitive assessments. "I have their reports. I have video recordings of Edmund conducting business in each of the 18 months prior to his death. I have testimony from 4 colleagues and 2 judges who interacted with him professionally during that period. The physician Prescott has found will not be able to sustain that claim against this evidence." Nora exhaled slowly. "The deed," Harriet continued, "is structured in a way that places it firmly outside the category of marital property. The documentation of the gift's nature is thorough and has been filed in 3 separate jurisdictions. I reviewed Vermont property law extensively before advising Edmund on the structure, and I am confident in the position. When are Prescott's attorneys expecting your formal response?" 30 days. We'll respond in 7, Harriet said. "This challenge will not survive contact with the documentation we have." Edmund was very thorough. There was a brief pause. "He spent 2 years making sure you would be protected, Mrs. Whitmore. He was very specific about that. He came to Burlington 4 times to review the documentation and ensure it was complete. He wanted to make absolutely certain that if any of his children attempted what Prescott is attempting, they would not succeed." Nora said, "He never told me." "No," Harriet said quietly, "he didn't. He told me that was his great failure. He said it more than once." She paused. "But he made sure you were protected. That was what he could do, so he did it with everything he had." The letter arrived from Prescott's attorneys on the 8th day. It was formal and expensive looking, the kind of legal correspondence designed to convey authority and inevitability in its physical presentation, and it outlined the legal challenge in language that had been carefully constructed to suggest that Nora's position was far weaker than it actually was. She read it at the kitchen table with her morning coffee and set it aside. Harriet's response had already been filed. Theodore had confirmed that the physician's letter was being formally contested. The documentation of Edmund's cognitive capacity during the relevant period was, in Harriet's assessment, overwhelming. But there was something else she needed to do. She knew it was coming before it happened. She did not know precisely when, but she understood the logic of it. Prescott had filed a legal challenge, which meant the legal approach was now in motion. But Prescott had also, in 40 years of observing him, never relied solely on one approach to anything. He believed in pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. It was, she had always thought, the quality he had inherited most directly from Edmund. She was not wrong. They came on a Thursday afternoon, 15 days after she had arrived in Harlow. She heard the car before she saw it, an expensive engine on the dirt road driven by someone who was not accustomed to dirt roads and was managing them with the impatience of a person who finds inconvenience insulting. Then another car behind it, then a third. Prescott arrived first, then Cordelia in her own car, then Stellan in a rental, behind each of them a lawyer. She watched from the upstairs window as they parked in the clearing and got out and looked at the house with expressions that moved through a recognizable sequence. The prepared contempt of people who have been told something is a ruin, the confused recalibration of people confronted with something that is definitively not a ruin, and then the particular expression of people who are rapidly revising their estimate of what they are dealing with. Nora came downstairs. She had made tea before she heard the cars because she had felt in some part of herself that had been paying attention her entire life that today was the day. She opened the heavy oak door before Prescott had finished climbing the porch steps. "Hello, Prescott," she said. "Cordelia." "Stellan." She stood aside. "Please come in." She watched their faces as they entered the main room and absorbed the interior. The quality of the floors, the fireplace, the furnishings, and the photographs. Hundreds of photographs of Nora on every surface of every wall. Their faces as they moved through the room and understood what they were looking at went through another sequence of adjustments. Cordelia's expression was the most interesting. She had prepared a version of herself for this visit, a version that combined authority with magnanimity, the powerful person extending a reasonable offer to someone in a weaker position. That version began to show strain almost immediately because the house was not confirming the premise on which it had been built. "Please sit down," Nora said. "I'll pour the tea." She had set out the good china, Edmund's china, or rather, she corrected herself, her china, the beautiful old set she had found in the kitchen cabinets on her first full day in the house. She poured with unhurried precision. She served each of them without comment. She sat in the chair across from the sofa where Prescott and Cordelia had positioned themselves, Stellan slightly apart in a side chair, and she looked at them with the composed attention of someone who has been waiting for a conversation for 40 years and is finally having it on her own terms. Prescott cleared his throat. "Nor," he said, "we've come to discuss the property situation. We believe there has been a misunderstanding about what Father intended and about the true value of this property." "Really," Nora said. She took a sip of her tea. "What kind of misunderstanding?" Cordelia moved forward, slightly taking the familiar role of the person who delivers the difficult message in the pleasant voice. "Daddy clearly didn't fully understand the value of this property when the will was written," she said. "Now that we've done research and had the property assessed, we realize it's worth considerably more than anyone understood at the time. As his children and his primary heirs, we believe we have a legal right to shares of all significant assets." "This property is not a marital asset," Nora said. Her voice was pleasant and completely level. "It was deeded to me in 1984 as a gift completely separate from the marriage. My attorney in Burlington has documentation confirming this in detail." "We don't believe that structure is legally defensible," Prescott said. "We have attorneys who—" "You have attorneys who filed a challenge," Nora said. "And my attorney has responded with documentation that your attorneys will find very difficult to contest." She set her teacup down on its saucer. "But before we go further down that road," she said, "I think there is something you should understand about what else your father left me." She stood and walked to the study. She returned with 3 folders and set them on the coffee table between the sofa and her chair. Each folder was labeled in Edmund's handwriting, one name on each. She sat back down. "Your father spent 40 years as one of Boston's most experienced attorneys," she said. "He documented everything he learned about everyone. Everything." She looked at each of them in turn. "He never used this information. That would have been unethical, and he was too good an attorney to compromise his ethics. But he kept it. He kept it for 40 years, meticulously organized, and he left it all to me." The room was very still. Those folders contained documentation of certain financial arrangements and personal matters that each of you would strongly prefer remain private. "I have reviewed them. I understand their implications." Prescott's face had gone very careful and very pale. "You're bluffing," he said. His voice was not as steady as he intended it to be. "I never bluff," Nora said. "Your father taught me that." She looked at each of them with the unhurried clarity of someone who has arrived somewhere after a very long journey and has no intention of being moved from it. "Prescott," she said, "your business dealings contain certain decisions that would not survive a formal review. Cordelia, your financial arrangements during your divorces involve some omissions that the relevant parties did not know about and would not appreciate. Stellan, your tax filings for the past decade are not as accurate as they appear." Stellan looked at the window. Cordelia's carefully composed expression had developed a hairline fracture along its surface that widened visibly as Nora spoke. Prescott was very still. "Your father collected information the way some men collect art," Nora said, "with care and patience and a genuine understanding of value. He never weaponized it because he was better than that. But he left me the option to protect myself if I had to. And he left me enough to know that I will be believed if I have to use it." She stood. "Here is my offer. It is the only offer I will make, and it will not be extended a second time. Walk away, accept the will as written. Live your lives with your trust funds and their conditions in your mansion in Brookline, with its preservation requirements and its mortgage. Leave me alone in this house with the property your father left me." She looked at each of them one final time. "If you continue to challenge me in court, if you attempt to pressure me in any form, if you make my life difficult in any way, I will release everything in those folders. Your reputations, your professional standing, your carefully maintained public images. All of it." She gestured toward the front door. "You know where your cars are." The silence that followed had a specific weight to it. The weight of people recalibrating the entire architecture of a situation they had entered with one set of assumptions and were now standing inside with a completely different one. Prescott stood. "We'll need to discuss this privately," he said. His voice had the particular tightness of a man maintaining composure through significant effort. "Of course," Nora said graciously. "Take whatever time you need." She walked them to the door. She stood on the porch and watched them walk to their cars. Watched the brief and clearly strained conference that took place in the clearing. Watched Prescott's face as he talked in a low voice to the two lawyers who had driven out separately. Watched the lawyers' faces as they listened. Then the car started and drove away down the dirt road under the canopy of ancient oaks, the expensive engines getting quieter and quieter as they retreated toward the paved road and the state highway beyond it, and the life they had been certain until this afternoon they were going to continue to live exactly as planned. Nora stood on the porch until she could not hear them anymore. Then she sat down on the porch steps and looked at the clearing and the trees and the darkening sky above the canopy, and she felt something settle through her that she had not felt in 40 years. Not triumph exactly, not relief, though relief was part of it. Something quieter than triumph and more permanent than relief. The specific feeling of a woman who has finally, after a very long time, sat down in the right chair. Nora was in the kitchen when the phone rang, standing at the farmhouse sink, with both hands in warm soapy water, washing the breakfast dishes in the particular unhurried way she had begun to move through the mornings in Harlow, without the choreographed efficiency of a woman managing a household built around someone else's schedule. The water was warm, the kitchen was quiet. Through the window above the sink, the forest was doing what it did every morning, conducting its own business entirely independent of what was happening inside the house. She dried her hands and answered, "Nora." Prescott's voice had a different quality than it had ever had in 40 years of their association. Not warm exactly. Prescott Whitmore had never been warm toward her, but something had been removed from it that had always been present before the particular edge of a man who has calculated that he has the advantage and intends to use it. That edge was gone. What remained sounded, she thought, almost tired. "We're withdrawing the challenge," he said. "Our attorneys have reviewed the documentation your attorney provided and have advised us that proceeding would not be productive." She waited. "The property is yours," he said. "We won't contest it further." She stood in the kitchen and listened to the formal precision of those words, the careful language of someone who has had considerable assistance in constructing a sentence designed to concede as little as possible while conceding everything necessary. "I appreciate you telling me directly," she said. A pause. "The folders," he said. "Father's files. You said you wouldn't use them if we walked away." "I said that," she confirmed. Another pause longer. "Will you?" he said. "No," Nora said. "Your father kept that material for 40 years and never used it because using it would have been wrong. I have no interest in being different from him in that particular way." The silence on the line had a quality she had not expected from Prescott Whitmore, something that might in a different man with a different history have been called relief. "Thank you," he said. She ended the call and set the phone on the counter and looked out the window at the forest for a moment. Then she finished the dishes. Harriet Solberg came to Harlow 2 weeks later. She drove up from Burlington in a sensible car and parked in the clearing with the ease of someone who had been told to expect a dirt road and had dressed accordingly. She was 63 years old, with close-cropped gray hair and the direct gaze of a woman who had spent her career in courtrooms and had long since stopped adjusting her presentation for the comfort of the people she was meeting. She walked up the stone path and shook Nora's hand at the door with a single firm movement. "I'm glad you called when you did," she said, following Nora into the kitchen. "Edmund always said you would handle it exactly as you handled it. He said you were the most practically intelligent person he knew, and that given the right information, you would make exactly the right decisions. He had a great deal of confidence in me that he rarely expressed," Nora said. Harriet sat at the kitchen table and accepted the coffee Nora set in front of her. "He expressed it to me extensively," she said. "Over the 2 years we worked together on the documentation for this property, he spoke about you with a regularity and a specificity that was frankly unusual for a client relationship. He told me about your garden. He described the roses you grew from bare root stock and the herb garden you had designed and the way you could identify a plant in a poor condition from 20 feet away and diagnose what it needed. He told me about the way you ran his household, not with admiration for its efficiency, though he clearly had that too. More with a kind of wonder at the fact that you did it all without any apparent recognition or gratitude from anyone who benefited from it. Nora looked at her coffee. He felt guilty, she said, about the lack of recognition. He felt a great many things, Harriet said carefully. Guilt was part of it. Love was a much larger part, but he also felt something that took me some time to understand. He felt that the greatest service he could perform for you was to ensure that the recognition, when it finally came, was legally bulletproof and financially permanent. He believed that the most honest expression of how he felt was not in how he spoke to you in daily life, which he knew was inadequate, but in what he built for you over 40 years. She paused. Whether that was wisdom or rationalization, I leave to you to decide. I'm an attorney, not a philosopher. Nora smiled slightly. It was the first smile she had produced in this kitchen that felt fully her own. There are some remaining matters to review, Harriet said, opening her briefcase. They spent 2 hours at the kitchen table going through the formal documentation of Nora's ownership, the trust structure covering expenses, the specific terms of the conservation land's potential sale or management, the legal confirmation that Prescott's withdrawal was binding and complete. Harriet explained each element with the thoroughness of someone who understood that her client was intelligent and deserved complete information rather than reassuring summaries. By the end of the 2 hours, Nora understood exactly what she owned, what it was worth, and what her options were. The land alone, if sold to the conservation organizations that had already expressed interest, would generate between $3 and $3.8 million. Edmund had been conservative in his letter. The house itself, assessed as a historic structure with its original elements intact, was worth an additional $800,000 as a standalone property. She did not need to sell anything. The trust covered all expenses, but she could, if she chose, transform this property's value into financial security of a kind that no one could take from her and no one could manage for her or make decisions about on her behalf. What Edmund had left her, she understood, sitting at the kitchen table with the documentation spread in front of her, was not simply property. It was what property represents at its most fundamental. The ground beneath your feet that belongs to no one else. The walls that keep out the weather. The door that you can open or close according to your own judgment without asking anyone's permission. After the attorney left, Nora walked the property. She had done this every day since arriving, moving through the grounds in the morning, before the day organized itself around practical requirements, learning the land the way she had learned the Brookline house in the first years of her marriage, by walking it repeatedly until it became familiar, in the particular way that places become familiar when you are paying genuine attention. The formal gardens she had begun to assess with a gardener's eye, identifying what had survived the period of reduced maintenance and what would need to be restarted from the beginning. The rose beds were in better condition than they looked at first glance. The structure of the original plantings was intact, the old roots still viable beneath the overgrowth. The kitchen garden was a pleasant chaos of self-seeded herbs and volunteers, things that had decided on their own to continue growing without being asked to. The stone fountain at the center of the formal area had a hairline crack in its basin that could be repaired. She had already called a stonemason in Harlow about the fountain. He was coming Thursday. She walked to the far edge of the cleared area where the formal gardens gave way to the mixed forest of the larger property. 247 acres stretched away from her in every direction, old hardwood forest with some sections that might not have been significantly disturbed. In a very long time, trees, whose diameter suggested decades of uninterrupted growth. She stood at the edge of the clearing and looked into the forest. Edmund had walked here. Every month for 40 years, he had walked on this ground, in this particular light, among these particular trees. She tried to understand what it had been for him, this private place, this separate life. Whether it had been primarily about her, about the sanctuary he was building in her name, or whether it had also been about himself, about the man he could be when the performance of his Boston life was temporarily suspended. She thought it was probably both. She thought that perhaps those two things, being the man he wanted to be and building something for the woman he loved, had been for Edmund the same project. She turned and walked back toward the house. Theodore Brandt drove up from Boston on a Saturday in late April, 6 weeks after Nora had arrived in Harlow. He came alone, which she had not expected. He parked his car with the slightly self-conscious care of a man who had driven a good car down a dirt road and was mildly concerned about what it had done to the undercarriage, and he stood in the clearing for a moment looking at the house before he came up the path. He looked, Nora thought, watching him from the kitchen window, like a man who has been carrying something for a long time and is uncertain how to set it down. She had the tea ready when he knocked. They sat on the porch. The day was clear in the particular way of late April in Vermont, a clarity that felt hard-won after a long winter, the light doing something precise and beautiful with the new leaves on the oaks. Theodore wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the clearing. "I owe you an explanation," he said. She waited. "When Edmund came to me about the will language, the domestic services language I told you, I argued against it. That was true. What I didn't tell you because I wasn't certain it was my place was what else he said in that meeting." He turned the mug slowly in his hands. He said, "Theodore, she will be hurt by those words. I know that, and I cannot avoid it. But if I write this will in a way that makes it obvious she has been well provided for, Prescott will challenge it before I'm in the ground. He will argue undue influence. He will argue diminished capacity. He will hire physicians who will say whatever he needs them to say. I need him to believe he has won everything so completely that a challenge seems unnecessary. I need him to be satisfied." Theodore looked at Nora. He spent the last 2 years of his life, he said, thinking almost entirely about how to protect you after he was gone. Every meeting we had returned to the same question. Have we closed every possible avenue through which they could take this from her? Have we been thorough enough? Is there anything we've missed? He paused. He was not a demonstrative man, as I think you know. He expressed himself through work, through the precision of legal structures and the thoroughness of documentation. But in those last 2 years, sitting in my office, going through the details of what he was building for you, he talked about you with a kind of openness that I had not seen from him in 30 years of professional relationship. Theodore set his mug down. He said that his greatest regret was not protecting you publicly while he was alive. He said he had told himself for 40 years that peace with his children was worth more than conflict, that as long as he was providing for you materially, as long as you were comfortable and safe, the social indignities they subjected you to were manageable. He said he understood only in his last years how wrong that calculation had been. Nora looked at the oak trees at the edge of the clearing. He was right that it was wrong, she said, but he was also right that he could not undo it. So he did what he could do. Yes, Theodore said, that is exactly it. He did what he could do. They sat in the quiet of the Vermont morning for a while, the two of them, the attorney who had kept Edmund Whitmore's secrets for 30 years and the woman those secrets had been kept both from and for. Before he left, Theodore reached into his briefcase and placed an envelope on the porch railing between them. He asked me to give you this when things had settled, he said, when you had had time to understand the full scope of what he left you. He said you would know when the right time was and that I would know it when I saw it. He stood and shook her hand with both of his. For what it is worth, he said, I have been practicing law for 30 years, and I have never seen a man go to greater lengths for anyone than Edmund went for you. That does not excuse what he failed to do while he was alive. I am not suggesting it does, but I wanted you to know it. He walked to his car. Nora watched him drive away down the dirt road and then looked at the envelope on the porch railing. It was smaller than the letter had been, sealed with the same dark red wax pressed with the same ring. No inscription on the outside. She broke the seal. Inside was a deed and a short note. 20 acres on the eastern edge of Harlow Township. A small barn and a cottage paid in full deed in your name. Also a trust of $500,000 established specifically for whatever purposes Nora Elaine Whitmore chooses to pursue in the life she builds from here. And below that, in Edmund's precise handwriting, the last words he had left her. You spent 40 years living my life. Now live yours. Build something. Create something. Transform something. This is your blank canvas. Paint it however makes you happy. You deserve that. You always did. All my love, always. Edmund. She drove to see the 20 acres the following morning. The cottage was small and solidly built, set at the edge of a meadow that opened to the south with the kind of light that a gardener recognizes immediately as exceptional. Growing light, full sun from mid-morning through late afternoon, protected from the north by a line of mature spruce that blocked the worst of the winter wind. The barn behind it was in good condition, its structure sound, its interior large enough to serve several possible purposes, depending on what the person who held the deed decided to do with it. Nora stood in the meadow in the morning light and looked at the cottage and the barn and the 20 acres that contained them, and she thought about what Edmund had written: build something, create something, transform something. She had been thinking about it since the night she had first read those words, not planning exactly. More like listening for what wanted to be built here, the way you listen for what a garden wants to become, rather than imposing a predetermined design on it. She had been listening, and what she kept hearing in the quiet of the mornings in Harlow, in the conversations she had been having with Dorothea, and with the people Dorothea had been introducing her to, in the things she had felt during her own 30 days of sudden displacement and terror, was something specific. She knew what she wanted to build. She went to find Dorothea. Dorothea Finch was a woman who processed information with the direct efficiency of someone who has run a small business in a small town for 40 years and has learned that the difference between a good idea and a good outcome is primarily a function of whether the person with the idea is willing to do the work. She listened to Nora's description without interrupting. They were sitting in the back room of the general store, which served as Dorothea's office and inventory space, and Nora had come to understand over the preceding weeks as the informal gathering point of Harlow's civic intelligence, the place where things got decided and organized and set in motion by people who had no official title but considerable practical authority. A retreat center, Dorothea said when Nora finished. Not a luxury retreat, Nora said. That's not what I mean. A place for women who have spent their lives in service to other people and need time and space to figure out what they actually want. Widows, women leaving difficult situations, women who have been, for whatever reason, without a room of their own for a long time. She thought about the 30 days in Brookline, the nights of lying awake calculating how long $50,000 would last at various levels of frugality. The specific terror of being 68 years old and suddenly unmoored from everything that had organized her existence. Women who need a sanctuary, she said, the way this house was a sanctuary for Edmund, except available to more than one person. Dorothea looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked up. How many women are you thinking at one time? 6 to start, Nora said. The cottage has 4 bedrooms and the barn can be converted. The main house would be my residence, but available for shared use. She paused. Edmund left me a trust specifically for this. $500,000 for whatever I choose to pursue. And the property itself provides more than enough space. Dorothea nodded slowly with the specific rhythm of a woman thinking through logistics rather than sentiment. You're going to need a nonprofit structure, she said, and liability insurance, and a proper access road to the cottage. And you should talk to Pastor Reeves at the church because he has been running grief support groups for 3 years, and he knows every woman in 4 counties who has recently lost a husband or a marriage or a way of life. She stood and went to the desk in the corner and pulled out a notepad. You're also going to need help for the first year at minimum, she said, sitting back down with the pad in front of her. Someone who knows Harlow and knows the people here and can help you navigate the county permit process, which is going to be its own adventure. She looked at Nora. I will do it, she said. I have been running this store for 38 years, and my nephew is entirely capable of running it without me for a year. I have been waiting for something worth doing with my time, and I believe this qualifies. Nora looked at the woman who had met her at her car on her first day in Harlow with a basket of groceries and a piece of information that had changed the entire shape of what she understood about her life. Yes, Nora said, I would like that very much. The work of the following months had a quality unlike anything Nora had done in 40 years. Not because it was easy. It was not easy. The nonprofit paperwork was labyrinthine. The county permitting process for converting the barn was exactly the adventure Dorothea had predicted. The renovation of the cottage required contractors who were available on a Vermont schedule rather than a Boston schedule, which was a different thing entirely. There were structural assessments and environmental reviews and neighbor consultations and insurance negotiations and the specific complications of connecting an additional building to the property's existing utilities. There were mornings when the weight of the administrative complexity threatened to convince her that she had been naive to attempt it. And then there would be an afternoon when she was working in the cottage garden, clearing the ground for the bed she was planting, and she would stand up and look at what was being built around her, at the barn skeleton emerging from its old boards as the renovation progressed at the meadow, with its exceptional south-facing light at the line of spruce that blocked the north wind, and she would feel something she had felt almost continuously since that first afternoon in Harlow, an emotion she was still learning to name. She was making choices. Every single choice being made on this property was hers. The garden design was hers. The barn's renovation plan was hers. The program that was taking shape for Whitmore House, which was what she had decided to call it, the name chosen not in deference to Edmund, but in recognition that the name had been earned through what she was building, rather than inherited through what she had endured, the program was hers. She was 68 years old, and she was making choices about her own life for what felt in many ways like the first time. The formal resolution of the will came through on a Thursday afternoon in May. Harriet Solberg called with the news in her characteristically direct manner. Prescott's withdrawal was confirmed in court. The will was closed. Nora Elaine Whitmore was the sole legal owner of the Harlow property, its contents, its 247 acres, and all assets associated with it without condition or challenge. Nora thanked her and ended the call and stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she put on her jacket and went out to the garden. She had been working on the rose beds for the past 3 weeks. The old plants, the ones that had been growing untended through the years when Edmund maintained the property, but did not have the specific knowledge to maintain the garden to its potential, had responded to proper attention with the particular gratitude of growing things that had been struggling unnecessarily. She had cut them back hard in the early weeks, the counterintuitive act of reduction that precedes renewal, and they were now showing exactly what she had known they would show, the vigorous new growth of plants, whose root systems were deep and established and had simply been waiting for someone to understand what they needed. She knelt in the soil and worked her hands into it and felt the specific temperature and texture that told her what it required. Her hands knew this language. They had always known it. It was the most honest knowledge she possessed, learned not from books or instruction, but from decades of paying attention to the actual conditions of actual soil. She worked for 2 hours. When she came in and washed her hands at the farmhouse sink, the light was going from golden to amber through the kitchen windows, the specific light of a late spring afternoon in Vermont that made everything it touched look more precisely itself. She dried her hands and looked out at the garden. The roses were coming back. The news from Boston arrived in pieces over the following months, not through any deliberate effort on Nora's part, but through the natural circulation of information between people who know people who know people. Theodore called in June to let her know that the Brookline house had finally sold after 9 months on the market for considerably less than Prescott had originally projected. The historic preservation requirements, though, had significantly narrowed the field of potential buyers. The mortgage Edmund had taken out had required full repayment at sale. After legal fees, preservation compliance costs, and the mortgage, the 3 children had split a net amount that represented perhaps 30 cents on the dollar of what they had believed they were inheriting. Cordelia's trust distributions, Theodore had heard through channels, were proving difficult to access. The stability requirements she needed to satisfy for consistent access to her funds were structured in ways that her current life circumstances could not meet. Prescott was by all accounts working very hard to maintain the continuous employment and ethical compliance his trust demanded. The annual evaluation by the retired federal judge had produced in the first year a detailed and not entirely favorable report. Stellan had not managed his investment trust adequately for 3 consecutive quarters. The automatic dissolution clause was being reviewed by the trustee. Edmund's revenge, which he had never called revenge, but which was revenge in its most precise legal form, was proceeding exactly as he had designed it. Nora received all of this information and felt each time something she could not straightforwardly describe as satisfaction, but was adjacent to it. Not pleasure in their difficulty exactly. Something more like the specific feeling of watching a system function as designed, of watching Edmund's 40 years of careful work produce exactly the outcome he had intended. He had been a lawyer his entire adult life. He had thought in outcomes and structures and long consequences. He had understood that the most durable form of any action was the one built into the architecture of things from the beginning rather than applied to the surface afterward. He had been right about that. She wondered sometimes in the evenings on the porch with her tea whether she could forgive him. Not the formal forgiveness of religious exercise or therapeutic prescription, but the actual internal event of releasing the weight of something. The weight of 40 years of being publicly diminished by people he had the power to stop, of being described in his own will as domestic help, of being left alone in a parking garage to cry in a 10-year-old Honda Civic, while his children divided his estate. She did not arrive at a clean answer. What she arrived at over time was something more honest than forgiveness and more useful than its absence. She could hold both true things simultaneously. He had failed her in ways that had cost her enormously and that she had not deserved. And he had loved her with a thoroughness and patience that in its own constrained and complicated way had been genuine. Both of those things were true. She was beginning to think that the ability to hold two true things that pointed in different directions was perhaps the most sophisticated capability a person could develop. More sophisticated than certainty, more honest than resolution. She held them both and continued her work. The first group of women arrived at Whitmore House in September. Dorothea had coordinated with Pastor Reeves as she had suggested, and with 2 social workers in the county, and with a women's shelter 40 miles away, whose director had been in professional contact with a network of similar organizations across 3 states. The application process that Nora and Dorothea had designed was simple and deliberately non-bureaucratic because Nora remembered very clearly what bureaucratic complexity felt like when you were in crisis, and she had no interest in reproducing it. 6 women came in the first cohort. A widow of 3 months from a small town in New Hampshire whose adult children had begun with gentle persistence to suggest that she was not capable of managing her own affairs. A woman of 64 who had spent 30 years as a caregiver for first her parents and then her husband, and had not been alone in the world or free to consider her own preferences for longer than she could accurately remember. A woman whose marriage had ended after 41 years when her husband had chosen in his late 60s a version of freedom that did not include her. A retired school teacher who had nowhere to go and no clear sense of who she was outside the role she had performed for 40 years. 2 others whose specific circumstances differed, but whose essential situation was recognizable to Nora in a way that required no explanation. She met them all at the door. She had thought carefully about what Whitmore House should be and what it should not be. It should not be a program in the clinical sense, a series of structured activities designed to produce specific therapeutic outcomes. It should not be a retreat in the commercial sense, a curated experience for people with resources sufficient to purchase curated experiences. It should not be organized around grief, because grief was not the point and dwelling in it was not the goal. What it should be and what she had tried to make it was exactly what she had needed and not had in the 30 days between the will reading and her departure from Brookline. Time, physical safety, the freedom to make small choices about ordinary things without anyone else's needs requiring priority. A garden because a garden is where the evidence of care made visible accumulates in ways that words cannot quite produce. A community of women who recognized each other's situation without requiring explanation. The first week was quiet. Nora did not organize activities. She showed each woman where things were and how the house functioned, and she made meals available at regular times, and she was present when presence seemed useful and absent when absence seemed more useful. She gave them the garden. She walked with each of them through what she had been doing there over the preceding months, the work of restoration and new planting, and she gave them plots of their own to tend if they wanted to tend them. Some did immediately. Some watched for days before picking up a trowel. One woman never went into the garden at all, preferring to sit on the stone wall at its edge and read, and that too was exactly right. By the end of the second week, something had happened that Nora had hoped for but not been certain would arrive. The 6 women had become a small community. Not in the organized way of a program, but in the organic way of people who are sharing a space and common circumstances and who begin over shared meals and evening conversations on the porch and mornings in the garden to recognize each other. Nora sat at the long kitchen table one evening and listened to them talk, these 6 women who had arrived in Harlow from their respective situations and had found themselves within 2 weeks talking to each other with the specific ease of people who do not need to explain their context because everyone in the room already shares it. She thought about the word sanctuary, the word Edmund had used for this house, the word that had been his private name for it across 40 years of monthly visits. She understood it differently now than she had when she first read it in Dorothea's initial greeting. She had understood it then as a place of refuge, a shelter from external threat. That was part of it, but it was not the whole of it. A sanctuary was also a place where something was protected, not by walls and locks, but by the quality of attention paid to it. The way a garden is a sanctuary for growing things, not because it keeps the weather out, But because someone has decided that what grows there matters and has organized the conditions accordingly. Edmund had decided that she mattered, had organized the conditions accordingly in the only way available to him, given his limitations and his fears and the particular shape of his failure. She had decided in turn that certain women mattered, that the experience of suddenly finding yourself outside the life you thought you were living at an age when the conventional wisdom suggested that the available options were contracting rather than expanding was an experience that deserved to be met by something better than terror and isolation. She had organized the conditions accordingly. In October, a letter arrived from Cordelia, not from Cordelia's attorneys, not formal correspondence, a personal letter handwritten on plain notepaper in Cordelia's neat, controlled script. It was 2 paragraphs long. The first paragraph said, "I want you to know that I am aware of how I behaved toward you for 40 years. I am not writing to ask for anything or to explain it or to suggest that awareness constitutes remedy." The second paragraph said, "My father was wrong about many things. He was not wrong about you." Nora read it twice. Then she set it on the desk in the small study and looked at it for a long time. She did not respond, not immediately. She was not certain whether a response was the right thing, and she was learning here in this house to sit with uncertainty when it presented itself rather than resolving it prematurely into action. She had not heard from Prescott or Stellan. She did not expect to. The fountain ran again in October. The stonemason had repaired the basin crack in the spring, and Nora had spent the intervening months figuring out the original plumbing system, which was eccentric in the way that systems installed in very old buildings by people who had improvised solutions rather than followed manuals tend to be eccentric. She had enlisted a plumber from Burlington who found the original mechanism more interesting than frustrating and had spent 2 days working out its logic with the focused patience of someone solving a puzzle. On the morning the water ran for the first time, Nora was in the garden with 2 of the women from the current cohort. They heard it before they saw it, the sound of water moving through stone, small and clear, arriving in the garden the way certain sounds arrive, not announcing themselves but simply being present, as though they had always been there. The 3 of them walked to the center of the formal garden. The fountain was running. Not powerfully, not dramatically. A modest, consistent flow water rising from the central basin catching the October morning light, running over the carved stone rim into the lower basin, circulating with the patience of something that had been designed to do this indefinitely. One of the women, the retired school teacher from the first cohort who had stayed on as a volunteer, looked at the fountain for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "I didn't know what I was going to do when I came here. I had no idea. I couldn't even think past the next day. And now I'm thinking about years." Nora said nothing. She stood beside her and looked at the fountain. "That is what it is for," she said finally, "to make years thinkable again." On the last Sunday of October, Nora drove to the small, white church at the center of Harlow. She had been attending since her second week in town, sitting in the same pew being greeted by name by people who seemed genuinely glad to see her, which was an experience she had not had in 40 years of attending functions in Boston, where she had been primarily seen as Edmund Whitmore's wife, a peripheral figure in the social geography organized around her husband's professional prominence. In Harlow, she was Nora, not Edmund's wife, not the woman who had been publicly humiliated in a conference room and arrived in town with 3 suitcases and a rusty key, not the woman who had confronted 3 hostile stepchildren in her own living room and sent them away, not the founder of Whitmore House, though people in town were increasingly aware of that. Just Nora, the woman who had arrived in a Honda Civic in March and had by October become someone this town recognized and welcomed and was glad to have. After the service, she walked back along the main street in the October light, which was the kind of light that Vermont produces in October, as if to demonstrate what light can become when the conditions are exactly right, everything saturated, in particular and alive with color that would be gone in 2 weeks. She walked slowly. She was in no hurry. She had nowhere to be for an hour, and she had learned over the preceding months to receive that hour as the gift it was rather than filling it anxiously with the next item on a list organized around other people's requirements. She was 68 years old. She had spent 40 years being exactly what other people needed her to be, the secretary who made everything run smoothly without requiring recognition, the wife who managed the house and the social obligations, and the 30 days of humiliation with a composure that never cracked in public, the invisible presence at the center of a life that had been organized entirely around someone else's prominence. She had been good at all of those things. She had brought genuine skill and care and intelligence to each of them. The skill and care and intelligence had been real, even when the context in which they were deployed had not fully deserved them. But she had also been for 40 years someone whose own preferences and ambitions and specific desires had been secondary to the organization of someone else's life. Someone who had made herself small enough to fit the space available to her without demanding that the space expand to accommodate who she actually was. She was not making herself small anymore. She turned at the end of the main street and looked back at Harlow from its northern edge, the cluster of buildings around the small square, the white steeple of the church against the October sky, the general store with its freshly painted awning, the library whose stone construction had been watching people come and go for a century and a half without particular judgment. This town knew her name. These streets were beginning to carry the specific familiarity of places you have moved through enough times to have opinions about the particular way the light falls on a specific corner at a specific time of day, the sound the gravel makes in front of the general store, the way the smell of the diner changes as you approach it from the north versus the south. She was beginning to belong somewhere. Not in the way that she had belonged to Edmund's life, which was the belonging of someone useful, someone whose continued presence was primarily organized around the function she performed. This belonging was different. This was the belonging of someone known, someone whose face prompted genuine recognition and genuine welcome from people who had no particular reason to welcome her, except that they had decided over the course of ordinary daily contact that she was worth knowing. At 68 years old, for what felt in many ways like the first time Nora Elaine Whitmore belonged to a place and a community that were hers by choice rather than circumstance, she walked back through town. At the general store, Dorothea was turning the open sign to closed for Sunday afternoon. She looked up when she heard footsteps and lifted a hand in the wave she gave to people she was genuinely glad to see, simple and unhurried. Nora lifted her hand in return. She walked the rest of the way back to the house under the October oaks, their canopies still full enough to filter the light into the dappled, moving patterns that fell across the dirt road, the same patterns that had welcomed her on the day she first drove this road, not knowing what waited at the end of it. She came through the gate and into the clearing. The house stood where it had stood for 200 years, its gray fieldstone walls holding the afternoon light, its slate roof dark against the sky, the ivy arranged in its train patterns against the stone. The fountain was running in the garden, the small sound of it audible from the clearing, patient and consistent. The roses were still blooming. Unusually late in the season, the deep reds and pinks that she had pruned into health over the summer, continuing to open as if they understood that this particular garden was being paid attention to and intended to respond in kind. She stood in the clearing and looked at all of it. The house that had been waiting for her for 40 years, the garden she had spent 6 months learning and restoring, the cottage in the meadow where 6 women at a time came to remember who they were outside the roles they had inhabited. The 247 acres of forest that did not ask anything of her except that she continue to be present on the land she owned. She reached into her jacket pocket. The compass was there. She had found it in the study on her second day in the house in the bottom drawer of Edmund's desk, and she had been carrying it since the weight of it in her pocket, a constant that she had not consciously decided to maintain, but had maintained anyway the way you maintain certain habits without entirely knowing why. She took it out. The brass had gone warm with the heat of her body, the deep gold of aged metal that had been handled regularly and with care. She turned it slightly in her palm and watched the needle which moved with her motion and then settled steady and precise, pointing where it had always pointed, north. She thought about where she had been in March. In the conference room with Theodore Brandt's careful voice delivering each word like something dropped from a height. In the parking garage in her 10-year-old Honda Civic. In the Brookline house packing 40 years of life into 3 suitcases and 2 boxes. On the highway with a brown envelope on the passenger seat and no understanding of what waited at the end of the road she was driving. She thought about the woman who had driven that road. The woman who had spent 40 years being told in the language of omission and exclusion and the elaborate architecture of other people's expectations that she was secondary, that she was peripheral, that what she brought to every room she entered was useful rather than valuable, functional rather than irreplaceable. That woman had driven a dirt road in Vermont and opened a heavy oak door and found something waiting for her that had been waiting for exactly as long as it needed to wait for exactly the person it had been prepared for. She put the compass back in her pocket. She walked up the stone path to her front door. She had letters to write this evening, correspondence about the next cohort of women arriving at Whitmore House in November, logistics to finalize with Dorothea, a call to return from Harriet Solberg about a minor administrative matter related to the property trust. She had a garden to tuck in for winter, which was its own particular work, the work of protecting what you had cultivated through the warm months against the cold months ahead, knowing that the protection was temporary and the return of growing things was not a hope, but a certainty built into the nature of the thing itself. She had in the study under the stairs a blank notebook she had bought at the Harlow General Store 2 weeks ago that she had not yet opened but was beginning to understand what she wanted to write in it. She had 68 years of living and 40 years of paying very careful attention to the conditions under which things grew and the conditions under which they failed to grow. She had a house that was hers and a town that knew her name and a community of women who were finding in a meadow in Vermont that certain kinds of beginning are available to people who had been told that beginning was no longer available to them. She opened the heavy oak door. The house received her the way it always did, with a particular quality of warmth that enclosed spaces develop when they have been consistently inhabited by people who have genuinely loved them. A warmth that is not primarily temperature, but something older and less measurable. She stepped inside. The photographs of her younger self covered the walls around her, 40 years of unguarded moments, documented by a man who had loved her in the ways he was capable of love and failed her in the ways he was capable of failure. A man who had spent 40 years building her a fortress and had never quite found the courage to stand in the open and declare what it was for. She had found the courage for both of them. She hung her jacket on the hook by the door. She went to the kitchen to start the evening. She was 68 years old and she was just getting started.